Hey church, Pastor Josh here. At the beginning of Advent, we made available copies of Rebecca McLaughlin's book, Is Christmas Unbelievable? I also invited you to take the opportunity to join the Sunday school group or get together with 2 or 3 or 4 friends and discuss the contents of the book. 4 easy chapters. I love how Rebecca breaks things down to show us that yes, Christmas actually is believable. On top of that, I also shared with you on Sunday morning that Tyler Osner and I decided that we were going to get together and discuss things in front of a camera. Because I know some of you are not able to make the Sunday school group, and I also know others are so busy that sometimes getting together in a group can be quite challenging. So Tyler and I invite you to sit in with us as we discuss each chapter of the book. In this following this announcement, you will see Tyler and I discuss chapter 1 of Rebecca's book. I hope you join us. See you there.
Hey everyone, I'm Pastor Joshua Johnson here with Tyler Osner, and we're going to discuss the book that we handed out at church called Is Christmas Unbelievable by Rebecca McLaughlin. And we're going to discuss tonight just chapter 1, and then next week we'll talk about chapter 2. And so, as I said in Sunday service, I encouraged you if you had the opportunity to gather with 2 or 3 or 4 of your friends to talk about the book. Of course, at our Sunday school group as well, they're talking about the book. But I know for some folks, just arranging that time is a bigger challenge. And so Tyler and I wanted to do this for you guys so that, in a sense, maybe you could feel like you could be a part of a group and maybe learn something else. Because, like I said, I've done a little bit of extra research as I was thinking about what Rebecca was talking about. And so I hope you enjoy. Yeah. All right, so we are in chapter 1, and chapter 1 is called, Was Jesus Even a Real Person? What were some of your opening thoughts?
More than any of it, just the outside of Christian scholars, how you didn't just use the Bible to prove that Jesus was a real person, which obviously we all believe, but it's nice to reaffirm our belief with outside of our religious scholars. So that was one thing that was really throughout this whole chapter kind of opened my eyes to everything. So I was very happy in reading that and reaffirming my faith for sure.
Yeah, one of the things and what the style of Rebecca's writing is called apologetics. It's kind of giving the evidence, the reasons for why we believe what we believe, and that's where I appreciate books like this. Is that sometimes Christians of course it's challenging that we get into the Bible, but sometimes we read the Bible and think that only everything in recorded history about Jesus is just in the Bible, when in fact there are multiple others who have talked about Jesus and Christians that date back to just a couple of decades after Jesus ascended into heaven.
Yeah, and another thing was I'm still very new to James, and my prior church knowledge was not very forthcoming about James. So like him mentioning in this is still pretty new to me. So that was another thing that I'm still getting my head around, is Jesus' brother James. But this was really eye-opening for me. There's some other things I'm sure we'll get into as we go, but that was the biggest thing I really enjoyed was the proof outside of it. So she's an amazing writer. I really enjoyed it so far in just one chapter. So I might have to look at some other stuff we have from her. So.
Yes, and I've actually listened to her speak a little bit too, and she's excellent.
Yeah.
So in the beginning of the chapter here, of course, it talks about the question of Jesus being real. And she brings in the story about her 5-year-old who's telling her friends about focusing on Santa. Yeah. Focusing on Jesus rather than on Santa. And then she shares this survey at the bottom of the first page and into the second, that in Britain, in the United Kingdom, they did a survey in 2015 that only 40% of adults didn't think Jesus was a real person, and that 22% thought he was just a mythical or fictional character, which surprised me and didn't surprise me. What about you?
I think it was more surprising than not, but at the same time, kind of the way the Bible, some people see it as fictional, not necessarily that they didn't, more as, I should say, the miracles that happen, like they can't wrap their head that that is possibly something God could done for us. So, but at the same time, I could see, I would have thought that number would have been a lot lower.
Oh,
Like more people would have believed in Christ, but I'm thinking of in the U.S., you know, predominantly Christian. I've never been to UK, so I'm not sure on all of that, but
well, and that's where I've got pulled up on my laptop here. Barna actually has done some research on this, and this goes back to 2014. And so they found those who believe Jesus Christ was a real person who lived. And so the average was about 92%. The highest was the elders, and so that's the generation older than the boomers, was the highest at 96%. Millennials, still at 87%.
which is higher than I thought it would be, honestly.
Yes. Well, and then if you if you look on social media and you explore what how people talk about Jesus, whether it's Facebook, Twitter, you would think that number would actually be lower of the number of people who believe Jesus was real. And so that's where I think with anything you read, of course, you can't trust Google with everything. That there is people. The loudness of people does not necessarily equate to the actual number of people.
That's exactly what I was thinking as you were saying that. Was usually the smallest group make the most noise, and that's not always the biggest opinion. So, that's nice to know that what I was thinking was right.
Yeah. Well, this was such a problem, and I knew this before I read her book here, because she references Bart Ehrman, who is an atheist. But also a New Testament scholar, and he actually went and wrote a book that said, yes, there is a historical Jesus out there. Quit saying he didn't exist, because the evidence is ridiculously overwhelming.
Yes.
Of course, Bart Ehrman would stop at the miracles and the resurrection, but there is so much evidence in the Gospels and in the other sources that yes, Jesus was a real person, and yes, he was crucified. It's the miracles and the resurrection where
he splits.
We split off. The story split off.
Yes. So, but yeah, it's nice to see that people on the other side are at least understanding where we're coming from and agreeing with us. Now we just got to get them the rest of the way.
Yes, absolutely. Well, and I think that's, again, as we talked about just a moment ago, a small group of people can just seem, large just by the loudness of which they project themselves, where you've got respected people in the field, even though he and I disagree on the significance of Jesus, you've got respected scholars be like, hey, you need to stop spreading out false information. I mean, talk about fake news.
Yeah, that is for sure. But.
Oh, goodness. And so for those of you who are watching, and if you haven't read the book yet, she's referencing, as far as Barman, his book. It's titled "Did Jesus Exist? The Historical Argument for the Jesus of Nazareth." And I actually have on my bookshelf, not his book, but another book about Jesus as a historical person from a Christian New Testament author, Craig Keener. And it's called "The Historical Jesus," and the book is that thick.
Wow.
It's getting closer to where I'm going to read it. But it's something I'm actually looking forward to, because I enjoy the historical stuff, and it just goes to show, when you've got a book that thick about the historical Jesus, there's enough. There's a lot of evidence out there.
Well, so many people in the world, and I'm one of them. If you show the proof, they're more likely to believe. And I think with history, that's a lot of it. If you can prove it, it's a lot easier to believe. And as we've taken that step of believing, sometimes you just need that extra push to, I made the right decision. I have the right faith. So, and what he was saying here goes back where, like we were saying, it's not just the Gospels that he was going off of. He was going off of, you'd probably be able to pronounce this a lot easier than I would, but Josephus, being able to quote him, and even saying he's not one that, not direct quote, but pretty much saying he's not one to make something up for the benefit of the Christian faith. So
Yes.
he's definitely outside of that, but he did mention that, Jesus' life and death. So that's a good place, again, proof that we would need.
Well, and that's what I appreciate Rebecca in this first chapter is that I know, for me, naturally, I would jump right into the Gospels, and she does that in chapter. She does that in chapter 2.
Yeah.
But here she covers what, of course, what Ehrman covers, what Craig Keener would cover in the book I'm about to read, is these outside sources. And so you mentioned Josephus already. There is also Pliny the Younger. I'm not sure how to totally say his name, Celsus. And then there's Tacitus. Tacitus is the Roman historian that we rely on a lot in school to teach about Roman history. And so you've got credible historians, who are a century or 2 or 3 behind saying, yes, this was happened. A person. Yes, these are Christians who believed in Jesus and worshiped him as God in the flesh. And the dates here too, I think astound me because I think one of the things we also don't realize, and I can't remember if Rebecca gets into it later in the book, is that the copies we have of the Gospels and some of these writings are really close, historically speaking, to when Jesus lived, died, and was raised. A lot of the stuff, and I guess Tacitus would be the exception, and a lot of stuff we know about Rome, ancient Greek, the earliest copies have centuries of distance, where copies of the Gospels are within 1 to 2 decades.
Yeah. And that's what, like with Josephus, I think I'm
Josephus.
saying. Josephus. I'll get it at some point. But saying within 3 decades after Jesus' death, to me, that's pretty significant. Because that would have been in most likely his lifetime or very close to. I'm no expert by any means, but at least for sure his parents.
Yeah. Well, be like today writing about the 80s. Yeah. So it's really not for Josephus. That's not that long of a time.
No.
So for me, even though I grew up in the 80s, there's not enough gap to really say that we lose some of the things we could talk about what happened 30 years ago.
It's not quite the game of telephone. So.
Yes, exactly. She goes into that in the next chapter. I did peek ahead a little bit. Just kind of summarizing what we just talked about, Josephus, of course, he writes in about 93. He writes also about what happened to James, Jesus' brother. That it was about 62 A.D. And of course, Tacitus talks about what happened in 64. And so again, these are just 3 decades after Jesus was.
Yeah, very close.
And then Pliny the Younger, he's a little bit further. Pliny the Younger, he was a Roman governor in about the Turkish area, which is Turkey now, from 109 to 111. So only a couple of years as governor. And what astounds me is that we have a surviving record on how he's asking, how can I persecute Christians?
Yeah,
and
directly.
He interrogates these girls. And he's looking for ways. So how can we torture these people?
Yeah, pretty much. And one of the other things is that they do, and they quote one of the things that Tacitus says, and pretty much goes with what the gospel says about Pontius Pilate, and bringing up his name, which to me that's something that's very hard to lose in translations, which is a lot of times what people bring up when they are not believing. So, but it's one of those things that helps us bring everything together.
Yeah.
So,
and for a while, this is something that's not in the book. We didn't have any archaeological confirmation that Pontius Pilate existed until I think 20 or 30 years ago. Yeah. That they actually found something with his name on it.
Wow.
So that's where, when people say, well, there's not any historical evidence, it was like, well, a lot of cases just haven't found it yet. Yeah. Because the stuff is out there, and we could be 1 or 2 archaeological finds away from it, as close to original copy of the Gospels as we're going to get. Because Jesus didn't build buildings. Paul didn't, lay down highways. And so there's not going to be those things that they're going to be sticking out of the ground. But think how much of a bigger thing they built, this thing called the church.
Yeah.
That largest religion in the world, has on every continent. It's just it's mind-boggling, and so that's where again I get nerdy. My nerd side comes out when it comes.
I
to
enjoy it, so I'm
stuff.
very much a history person as well. And this just again, like I've said it several times, and this is all I kept thinking when I was reading this. Is this just gives me more firepower to reaffirm my faith? So, and that's what things like this and what Rebecca is wanting. So, yeah, I'm fully enjoyed this so far, but yeah. And some of the terminology too throughout this, like that you can tell she did some studying, like, what was it? Explaining what, there was something in here. The Crestians, and stuff like that, like stuff I've never even heard of, but, like, I feel like that's a lot of, she took the time to really go through it all.
She did, and you can tell she's British when you the Doctor Who reference.
Yes,
I know some people watch Doctor Who in the States, but I haven't. I just know of Doctor Who because of the commercials.
I would say the same thing, but it was kind of I read the introduction as well, and being able to pull that all together, I'm not creative enough to do that, but it totally made sense when how she pulled it back in on chapter 1 too. Which I'm sure, again, we're jumping ahead a little bit, but she does a great job.
Yeah. One thing I like how in this introductory chapter is that when you get into bottom 15 into 16, she talks about sharing the Christmas story. Actually, what is the story and filtering out all the stuff. And on Sunday morning, I've referred to the paraphernalia because. She refers to, little drummer boy, the donkey, a grumpy innkeeper, a stable, because, of course, as we've learned more about the context of the buildings and what an actual barn was, because there was an actual barn as we think there's a barn.
Yeah.
But they were probably in a back room where the animals were stored. So there was animals, and he was put in a manger. So he was there with the animals, but it wasn't like a separate structure.
And that's where the cultural differences of the times and today, but also what we would imagine a stable to be in, United States too. I feel like it's hard to paint the picture of what it actually was without people understanding what the culture was too.
So, I better say too that it's not that I'm saying these images are bad in themselves, but it helps us understand part of the timeline, I think, because when a woman gave birth, a space was considered ritually unclean, and you had to wait a week or so before you could basically start hanging out with everybody, and so that's why Jesus is born in the back storage space with the animals, because if he was in the main house, the house would be considered unclean. And then for them in that period, if you were unclean, you couldn't go to temple. You couldn't go to church, basically. Wow. You had to wait till after the allotted time was over. Even if it didn't involve you, just the fact that you were in the house or you touched something. And so that's part of the ritual aspect of and so we're kind of deviating a little bit, but
it makes a little bit more sense too. So,
sorry, I'm interrupting.
No, I work at a bank, so I think of business all the time. But as an innkeeper, your business is to keep people in the place. So if you got to keep people out for a week or however long, that hurts the bottom line. So I could imagine, even if you had a room, seeing that, that position, put him in a bad spot. He took care of her in the end, I guess. So.
Yeah. Well, and that where we get in is also, if I remember correctly, in the Greek, is kind of a spare room, a back room, because some of the places where they built houses was chiseled out of the rock.
Yeah.
And so it wasn't necessarily a structure as we built. They would sometimes, build it to a hillside or a mountainside, and so you kind of staggered often, so you had to chip in to get more space. And sometimes on those hot nights, like during the summer, you actually sleep on your roof outside because it was a lot cooler.
Yeah.
So showing she's talking about cutting through all the extra stuff, all the extra things that necessarily bad, but just again, she's wanting us to focus on the truth and the believability of the story as it's told in the Gospels. And so, of course, she refers to Matthew and Luke, which are the two Gospels that really focus on the Christmas story. Of course, Matthew, starting with Matthew 1, Luke's got some stuff in the beginning of 1, but of course it really kicks off in Luke chapter 2. And so, just to throw a question at you, as she was kind of covering the Christmas story and the true purpose of why Jesus came, because as she says in 17, that the people were assuming that someone's going to come to free them from the Romans, but came to address a deeper problem, which was sin. So just your thoughts on her, what she said there in 16 and 17.
That's a really good question. You really got me on that one.
You're good.
No,
I can ramble a little bit more if you need a moment.
Yeah, go ahead.
Well, I think one of the things that she drives at, and I think Jesus continually has to clarify in his ministry, is that he's not there for a political or economic or militaristic purpose.
Yeah, that's exactly what was going through my brain as you started saying it. Sorry, I didn't mean to cut you off.
You're good. I threw the question at you, so feel free.
But everyone was thinking that he was trying to come in to save them without having to do anything. He's coming in to save them as a group, save their souls more than save them from being ruled over by a Roman emperor, king, whatever you'd like to call him. But he was more wanting to save, again, their souls versus just going, it's kind of like your parents, or if you are a parent, you don't always try to fix everything for your kids. Sometimes you got to let them fend for themselves, but you push them in the right direction. Parent of a 2-year-old right now, that's kind of a lot of it is trying to push them in the right direction, let them make the decision. It usually goes a lot easier, but at the same time, trying to instill those good choices. And I think that's more of what God and Jesus were trying to do, trying to save us to go to heaven and be the savior of our bodies, not necessarily the piece of land you are on right now and who's ruling that. Yeah. So,
and I think that's where, for the Jewish people, sometimes ancient Jewish people, where they receive these prophecies that we have in the Old Testament. And so, there's going to, the throne of David's going to be everlasting. This is the promised land. There's going to be a Messiah figure that's going to come and reestablish the throne. And of course, I think they miss some of those things where, particularly as I've preached about in Isaiah recently, but it's also mentioned in Ezekiel quite a bit, that God's like, I'm coming myself.
Yeah.
And of course, we then have at the end of Malachi, I'm on the way. Of course, there's quite a bit of time, 4 centuries, but God's timing is perfect. And so I think sometimes, as whether time or misunderstanding, we can enter into the Christian life and be like, I'm presuming this thing, but God be like, I've got other ideas. I'm going to flip this thing on its head for you, so this way you can hopefully fully understand what I want for you and how I'm going to establish my kingdom in the world. No one expected the Savior, the Messiah, to show up as a vulnerable baby, creating social drama through these 2 kids.
Yeah.
Because the people's like, they were expecting the Messiah to come across the hill with an army, like, all right, time to kick some butt. But that wasn't the case.
No.
Because there was something deeper that needed to be addressed.
And I think a lot of times too, I'm definitely guilty of it, is we think very literally. I'm taking your word as exactly the physical thing you're saying, versus, there could be a lot of, the term I always hear, read between the lines, I guess, where, God's not necessarily always saying what he's saying is what's going to happen. He's going to do that. He's going to save us and take us to the promised land. But to me, the promised land's heaven. It's not necessarily Jerusalem or Israel. To me, the promised land is getting us to heaven to be better people and take us to everlasting peace and life. So,
yeah, and that's right. I think as Christians, as we look at it, as God, gave the promised land to the people of Israel in the Old Testament, but there's this reminder, and I can't remember if it's in the Psalms, but the earth is the Lord's and everything in it. So it's not like God's only got claim on this chunk of land. All of it says because He's created everything. Yeah. So focus is on redemption from sin. To get back to what Rebecca's talking about. And then she talks about some of the challenges in the Gospels as far as the timeline,
of the census.
but how so in some of the stuff I've read outside of what she's written here, there's probably, for one, the timeline is tough to establish because the first attempt to determine when Jesus was born, I found out the guy was actually off because, of course, we had BC and AD, and we found out, well, he was maybe about 4 years off. Yeah. And so Jesus now that we think was born maybe about 4 BC, and of course we can't correct
now where we're at
the timeline. We're not Marvel.
Yeah, can't just fix it all.
But she points out here that there was probably more than one census, and sometimes we found records was like, something did happen, and that's where I think a lot of people fail to understand Luke as its own gospel. So let me say this: Matthew, Mark, and John are written in the style of ancient biography, which has this particular literary style. So think of it this way: as we've seen see some differences in Matthew, Mark, and Luke, sometimes in Matthew and Mark, they write not necessarily in a chronological line, but maybe with a theological purpose. So we're sharing stories about our history. Do we always share our stories in chronological order? No. But are they true?
Yeah.
Yes.
And I'm the worst about that.
But that's where sometimes we got to understand ancient writing, because wasn't just a Hebrew thing or an ancient Israelite thing. That was the style of ancient biography. So Romans, Greek, sometimes they fudged their timeline a little bit. But with Luke, what makes him special is he writes in the style of an ancient history. So in a sense, he's providing an apologetic, a defense, an explanation, providing a timeline. Yeah. So that's why Luke and Acts is technically together. Yeah. Because Luke is writing to the guy who's basically paying for it and says, here's everything that has happened. I'm going to give you a historical record. And so that's where Luke, as I've heard some other historians, Christian and non, that Luke is reliable in how he treats history. So could the numbers be off? Yes. Do we know everything that happened in the ancient world officially, even with the big Roman government? No, because there's still stuff to be found.
Yeah.
Sorry, that was long-winded. I'm sorry.
No, it's definitely helpful with looking at all this. One of the things too is that what I was thinking when they're speaking about this, they're talking about a difference of 2 years, if I remember right. 62 to 64 is what the argument was, if I remember.
No, the Quirinius, Luke has 86.
Okay, maybe it wasn't bigger than what I was.
I guess I'm see. Herod died in 4. Oh, the known census was in 6. So there was about a 10-year difference. Okay. No, I'm sorry, in 4 BC, so 4 and 6. So that's a 10-year difference.
Okay. Well, what I was thinking with that is it's not like it is today. But I was thinking about we do a census every 10 years in the United States, but we have the ability of cars, we have the ability of the internet, phones. Even letters get there a lot quicker than it would be to walk, ride a horse, whatever. It's going to take a while to do that much of an area, let alone get everything right. And then probably by the time they're done, they're starting over. Yeah. I also read something, this was several years ago, about censuses at that time. A lot of times if a king or emperor, whatever you'd like to call them, didn't feel like they were getting enough tax money or enough grains, well, we need to run another census to see how many people are, to make sure what I'm getting is adding up. So that's what kept thinking in my mind when people are, I'm going to be surprised if they got one done and started over. Because.
Well, and that's the thing, as you said, is that for us, every 10 years, there is going to be a census. Back then, there wasn't a schedule. It was like, we need more tax money, or, there's been a lot of people moving around. We need to, figure things out. And so it was very just on the orders of the king or emperor to try to keep track of all the people moving around.
Yeah. So, and I'm sure in that time it's not as easy as throwing a spreadsheet up and going from there. You have
if you're chiseling stone. And of course, paper and ink, their equivalent, was expensive, and so you couldn't just pull out a fresh notepad. It cost money.
Yeah.
So that's where I appreciate the letters, because for Paul to write and for the early church to make the copies as they did, you had to spend more money than we would understand that would cost to write that stuff down. Let's see what else. I'm going to cheat and use my little notepad here. Speaking of
notepads.
Man, I think we've covered just about everything.
Yeah, the only other thing was I liked how she talked about the equivalence of Bethlehem. And when they were talking about, like, if Luke would have made up the census, there would have been a lot of easier things to do.
Oh, yeah.
Just like they're talking about here, invited his favorite uncle, invited him to stay. Like that, I would have made it something a lot more easier to believe than a census, something based off something outside of the faith. But also the significance of going to Bethlehem, being the descendant of David and sitting on the throne of David for everlasting, going to where David was from. It's that symbolism that the Bible does a great job of setting up the foreshadowing of what's going on. And I never really thought of that. It's one of those things. I'm very much a person of aha moments, 20 years later, but that was kind of one of the things that finally, once I read that, I was like, oh, that totally makes sense.
Well, I think it's a good catch on Luke recognizing large events compared to smaller events, which would have given him an out, because they didn't run a calendar like we did, and so you use major events like that to in essence keep time, and so that's right. I think again the reliability of Luke is so significant, and just because we don't have a paper record or something doesn't mean it didn't happen. You can't make an argument from silence. That's a logical fallacy, by the way. Yeah. So kids, write that down. But I want to make sure I reiterate what you just said, because I think that is important as we continue to study the Bible and realize there is, as we talked about earlier, there is a lot of outside evidence that supports the scriptures. But also, if there are challenges, that doesn't necessarily say anything's wrong. It's just we haven't totally figured it out yet. Because I saw a documentary a while ago that a lot of the timeline when it comes to the events in ancient Egypt, they might be like significantly off. And
I just listened to a podcast about that. Yeah. About how they're believing that ancient Rome might have been off by over 10,000 years. Yeah.
10,000 years?
10,000 years. That they could have had civilization there for over 10,000 years.
Like they're
in Egypt.
Okay. Yeah.
So, because they also believe, that's a whole nother thing. But
that's a whole other thing.
But yeah.
But that was interesting, because it wasn't off like by that much on this thing I saw about Egypt. It was, I think, a few hundred years.
Yeah.
And the gaps between the Old and Middle Kingdom and the intermediary periods where there's, I think, from my understanding, from what they said, an increase agreement that there might need to be some adjustments.
Yeah.
To at least the Egyptian time.
And I will say,
there's a reference to the Exodus. That's why I was curious.
Okay. Well, I will say it is very hot topic right now in the archaeological. It's about 4 or 5 very top end archaeologists that believe that, and then everyone else not. So, but yeah, it's stay tuned. We may.
Yeah, we have a whole lot of other stuff to talk about after we cover the book here.
And one of the last things as we're getting towards the end of this, again, I've had an epiphany with this, is when she was talking about who came to visit Jesus, and everything, had the three wise men who would have been easiest way of, high class society, down to shepherds who would have been seen as, low class, just what they have on is usually what they have, coming to see them, but also, believers and foreigners, believers and non-believers. Kind of opened my eyes to make me feel like God is saying with those visitors, everyone is welcome at the table, believe, yes, and you will see, our paradise. So, again, this one chapter gave me about 3 or 4 epiphanies, but that was probably the biggest one for me. Out of all of this. That was the biggest takeaway that I really enjoyed, and again, made me a better believer, was that right then and there, he brought in saying everyone's welcome. Kind of like what you say when we have communion. It's kind of what it reminded me of. Everyone's welcome to the table, and come on and continue. So that was really cool for me.
And that's and just some my concluding thoughts. I think that's where talking about the wise men, and she points out that they're not necessarily 3 of them. There was 3 gifts. Yeah. So we actually don't know how many wise men there were. There could have been 3. There could have been 10. I mean, could have been a whole entourage. Yeah.
And that's what I was about to say. Very rarely, from what I've read in those days, you would travel with just 3 people, especially someone of class that they would have been in. You most likely would have had slaves or servants of some sort, yes, who had been doing the heavy lifting for them. So it might have been the 3 main guys, but there's definitely more people with them from, yes, what I've understood. I'm no historian by any means, but I've read a few things. So. Not much, but a few.
I think with that, if you got anything else,
that was pretty much my last point there.
I think I'm good.
I'm ready to start chapter 2, though.
Absolutely. I guess as I'm reviewing the last couple paragraphs here, I think one thing to note too is that she mentions the time when Herod kills all the babies in Bethlehem. Yes. And back to some of the historical stuff, why don't we see that in history? Why isn't there an outreach for it? The thing is, we got to understand is that Herod was such a bad guy. This is a guy who killed family members when he just thought they were threats. Doesn't mean they were, but he
there
thought
might
they
be
were.
A chance.
And the fact that Bethlehem was a small community where, in the ancient world, this would not have been front page or even page 4 news. For us, it's first front page news.
And also in that time in the world, it probably wasn't uncommon.
Yes.
So, we see a lot of things today and think it's a travesty, but it's nothing compared to a lot of things that's happened in our history. And that's one thing we have to look at, time and place. It is a terrible thing. Yeah. But like you were saying, Bethlehem has been proven not to be, it's not a New York or an LA type of situation, but or even Jerusalem would have been those, and then this would have been a Burlington, probably, from what I've kind of understood, maybe a little bigger, but they take but also news doesn't. It's not like today either, where I can send a picture to someone in China, where getting it to somewhere took several days. That's why they had to travel, had to leave early before to get there. So unfortunately.
And I think all of it just goes to her point as we look at the reality of the situation, the history, is that Jesus, a real person in a real time, a real place, real dangers, real situations that, of course, in a sense, are removed from us as for 2,000 years as far as the conditions, but some of the similarities that, again, we live in a real time and place, and we don't present ourselves as fantastical, or even if we were to inflate a story, there's no way they could make things up because of the veracity of the gospel writers, and also the other ancient historians that wanted to record history. Now, some of them, maybe will fudge a little bit, but again, trying to record real people, real events.
Yeah. So, and Herod was not known to be a nice person either. He was definitely ruled with fear, and that was one thing that I think over several different
Hitler, Stalin, Kim Jong Il, and
whoever you want to
oh
name.
My goodness.
So.
All right, guys. That's it for us for tonight. Make sure you read chapter 2 and join us next time for that discussion. Take care, and God bless.